So we're going to talk about securely scaling decentralized governance. And oh yeah, and you just scroll. Oh, perfect. All right, so my name is Mike Lewellen. I work at OpenZeppelin. Very quickly about me, been working with blockchain tech for about 10 years now. Started with like mining, setting up wallets, general crypto consulting stuff with Bitcoin, and then started building with Ethereum in 2017. Did a lot of fun startup and corporate consulting projects, learned how not to do it most especially. Joined OpenZeppelin in 2021, did a lot of stuff on the audit team, mainly as a project manager, but I still got very hands-on the tech in terms of explaining things and building processes. And now I do solutions architecture, which is to say I figure out all the Legos that are security tools at OpenZeppelin and give our clients Lego kits that they can actually use in one clean package. So part of that has also been doing some security advisory work for Compound, which is a DAO that we partnered with earlier this year. And I also, on the side, like to do state public policy work in Texas, which is to say I work on legacy governance enough to know the problems there and potentially how to compare it to our problems. And then, yeah, you guys know what OpenZeppelin does. So the talk here is really to talk about decentralized governance, which I'm going to say is it's everyone getting a fair voice in how we make decisions and no one ultimately getting mad or feeling like they've been cheated out of a good governance decision, which, as you all know, is very difficult. It's especially difficult when we have more decisions that we need to make. The more decisions we need to make, the more complex they are as we move away from a yes-no to maybe a which auditor do we select to be our next partner for the next year, such as what we did with Compound. Like these get more complex. It's harder to make these decisions at scale. And I would actually kind of compare them in part to the scalability trilemma. Let's say we compare decentralization, security, and scale in governance. Getting all three properties in governance is actually fairly difficult in the same way that it is to get it in the throughput we would have in a blockchain protocol. So let's get a little bit more into what it means. We talked a lot about it already in several talks today, but I'm going to talk more at a high level conceptually. What we might be used to for a lot of people before DeFi and smart contracts was implicit governance. It was this concept of we're all running a blockchain node. We're going to reach consensus on how we're going to make changes to that blockchain node. And we're going to have an improvement proposal like an Ethereum EIP or a BIP from Bitcoin. And we're going to make these changes and have a social coordination around it. And then eventually we're going to make an upgrade and upgrade the reference client. And usually the protection you have on this is the fact that any contentious changes can be forked. The Bitcoin block size wars is an obvious example where people were able to fork off if they had different opinions. And there's also this threat that if you try to push through these changes without having broad consensus, then you're going to create bifurcation in the community and it's going to go poorly. So there's kind of a strong protection against, it helps to improve decentralization and security, but it doesn't really scale. You can't have a basic conversation around, who do we want to pay for a grant, and then make that an implicit governance proposal you put through an EIP. You're going to be sitting around for months or even years. So this is where explicit governance comes in. This is how we can encode on-chain processes to make decisions and then execute them, most especially with Ethereum smart contracts and DAOs. And these are things that we have all seen make decisions in the last several years. Protocol treasuries, obviously, is a big one. Millions, if not billions of dollars are managed now through DAOs. We have upgrades for improvements and bug fixes, which is something we can talk about a little bit more later. And then parameter changes to manage financial markets, configs, integrations with other protocols, listings, etc. So now we have this decision on chain. Great. Surely it can scale better. Well, maybe. Let's a little bit about who makes these decisions. You're all probably familiar with this. Admin account, one owner that basically can make decisions. And then you can go further and have a multi-sig. So 4 out of 7 of these key holders must agree to make a decision to make a change. Signal voting, which is a concept of we can cryptographically verify if the community, whether that be token holders or some other credentialed participants that can somehow be recognized on chain, we do an off-chain vote, which is fairly scalable, fairly flexible. It's usually non-binding, so it's kind of implicit on its own. But we can at least get like verifiable signaling of the community likes this or doesn't like this, and then we'll see who executes on that decision, whether it's a multi-sig or the next thing, which is a governor, which is a smart contract that actually does allow proposal execution after an on-chain vote gives approval, which you could say is kind of the closest thing to a true DAO. There's truly governance on chain, it's truly making decisions, and it's binding, and then it gets executed. So The obvious example for this is the compound governor. A lot of people have built their system off of this. We even have supported a version of it in OpenZeppelin library, and it goes through a simple system. We put it on chain, we have 2 days to review it, and then 3 days to vote. It has to hit a simple quorum in the case of compound, and then if the quorum is hit and the majority is yes, then we will time lock it for 2 days so people have time to see if they like it or not in terms of being able to exit the protocol, and then we execute it. Seems simple, seems fun, right? Well, there are pain points that come with this, and these are not really as much technical pain points, but really almost political governance pain points that end up affecting the technical execution of things. So one obvious one that's already been talked about today are the security of upgrades. And I'm sure we're going to talk more about this in a panel later. But we all understand intuitively that really what upgrades allow someone to do is take what is by default an immutable smart contract in Ethereum and build in the capability to change it. This is very useful if you want to make feature updates or fix bugs that could still potentially get in after deployment, but you also have given governance the powerful ability to break immutability. I will say at OpenZeppelin, we have upgradability in our library, and I think that has created a misconception that we are upgrade maximalists. I would say we're upgrade pragmatists, which is to say there are cases for upgradability in some parts of your protocol, but I would not necessarily throw it in there just because why not? Because you do have now this governance power that you have to very carefully manage and maintain. And even minor upgrades from third-party contributors, we've heard some examples today, could introduce issues that create bugs that could have a massive impact. And then, of course, they also can create issues for composability. Now you have a system such as Compound where you are listing tokens, and those tokens themselves could be upgradable, such as the Aave token, which is listed on Compound, is upgradable. So what happens if that upgrade then breaks an assumption that your protocol makes? There was an example of this actually with TrueUSD, which was listed on Compound about a year ago. There was actually an issue that Chain Security originally found, and then we had to figure out how to resolve. And there, first of all, a lot of people that came together in the community to make this happen. So the TrueUSD team was very accommodating. It was, in short, a double entry point that broke an assumption around how markets could be, essentially, a withdrawal could be made, and it could have had a critical impact. Luckily, we were able to fix it with upgradability. They were able to upgrade and remove the double entry point. But you have to also ask the question of, well, if they can upgrade and remove a vulnerability, can they upgrade and add a vulnerability accidentally? And this is the case for any protocol. So governance around how upgrades are made is a critical point for everyone to know about. And so we've replaced a technical problem, which is how can we fix bugs, with a governance problem, which is how do we decide how to fix bugs. The other thing we have is, well, something that affects all organizations at scale, but especially smart contracts, which is how do we handle operational overhead and accountability? We're doing all these things. We're managing treasuries, technical development, the protocol vision, and the roadmap. And if you have been on any of the DAO forums, you know that keeping track of just one DAO, much less several, is a full-time job. So many people, many token holders can't scalably vote on everything, so they end up delegating to usually delegates that are more active. Well, now these delegates have an outsized influence on the protocol, and the question of accountability comes in. Are the interests aligned with the token holders, or maybe not even just the token holders, but also the DAO in general? You know, it doesn't just token holders that are parts of these DAOs, but also many of the developers, many of the people using it, the average user that we are hopefully trying to reach, like the average person that just wants a thing they can use to borrow money from. How do we give other people a say? So the question of how token voting works, as well as whether the people that are delegated the most power are truly the ones best capable of making those decisions, is kind of murky right now. It's left up to communities to define that themselves. So we have to be very careful about that and ensure that we're not allowing that to kind of run away. And then finally, we have governance attacks, which is great. Governance, you have governance. Now you've increased your attack surface, because now there is a way for someone to make a decision that potentially will now introduce not just a bug, but actually take money in a malicious manner from the protocol or do something else, DOS it or something like that. So Beanstalk is a classic example of this from this year. Suffered a loss of $77 million when an attacker used a flash loan to borrow enough tokens to hit a supermajority limit. And so what they had is they had a one-day review for proposals. And what the attacker did is they submitted a proposal over the weekend. So no one's really reading it. No one's on call to look at every governance proposal. And so once that was passed through, once it reached the one-day mark, the attacker was able to utilize a system bug where normally it goes through a 7-day vote, but they said, well, you know what? If we hit 2/3 of token holders saying this is a good idea, then why would we bother continuing to wait for 7 days? Clearly, we have consensus, unless, of course, all of the 2/3 tokens were borrowed in a flash loan, in which case it's not exactly the consensus you would like, and they were able to then immediately execute the proposal, no time lock, and receive the funds. So as the number of and value of funds under DAO control continues to grow, we're going to have to be able to, essentially provide protections that scale with that particular honeypot. So this is really what we're facing right now in terms of like DAOs and governance is great, but there are definitely a lot of responsibility and just general security practices that have to come with it. Okay, so that's all terrible and scary. We probably all had war stories that we can all share around how DAOs are struggling to scale, but how do we truly get this to the point where a DAO or a decentralized entity isn't dependent on just getting lucky or just being, having watched the proposal and managed to cancel it in time? How do we design protocols to inherently protect against governance attacks? So the first thing, and several of these ideas have already been shared and discussed broadly in the community, and there's many links to these examples here, which is, first of all, enforcing long voting periods. So you have a lot of time to discuss and decide, and then having time locks. Even after you've supposedly reached consensus on chain, provide the ability to time lock it at least long enough for people to look. And then if there is some problem that is surfaced, you have the ability to cancel that proposal. And who has that execution ability? Well, in some cases, anyone can execute, but in other cases, they might actually still delegate that to a specific multisig. For example, Beanstalk removed the ability for anyone to execute, and they gave it to a multisig as a response to their attack to ensure that that couldn't happen again. The other thing is minimizing governance control, which is a great concept. And basically the idea is if you don't need governance control over certain things, don't do it. This is something that Rye is kind of classically known for proposing, but I can give you a more specific example, which is the controversial one right now, which is Tornado Cash. Everyone's heard that they've been sanctioned, and putting the legal and ethical discussions of Tornado Cash off to the side, and if you think about it just from the engineering goal of we want to build a system for privacy that can't be turned off, they accomplished that goal because despite the weight and power of the US government, it continues to run on Ethereum today. And that's because they did not build in governance controls. They have a DAO. There is a Tornado Cash DAO, but they did not give that DAO any ability to access user funds or turn off any of the protocol. So in that sense, they have succeeded. There's a broader discussion around whether they should succeed or not. That is for another day. You can increase the cost of malicious governing attacks. You can make it difficult to get tokens. You can try to limit its ability to be borrowed. And this can even come down to how you distribute your token, or even maybe use something different like an ERC-721 token, or don't even use tokens specifically. You do things like what Optimism is doing, which is to not just have token holders, but also developers with some other sort of on-chain credential that have a share of power and decision-making. And then in general also, so another thing is, this is something that we've started to think more about with Compound, is how we kind of build security processes for DAOs specifically. So a lot of talks already about how you can do quality assurance with testing suites and code reviews and formal verification, and tons of other things just to make sure that code is secure. But from my perspective, I'm wondering, okay, then how do we insert this in a method that we can provide for every proposal going through? And I think of this from the perspective of kind of like who's seen the Schoolhouse Rock, like I'm just a bill? Like basically, so that, but for proposals. And that also codified for proposals so that people understand exactly what it goes through to get your proposal up, especially depending on the type of proposal. Is it a financial proposal? Is it an upgrade? Is it a grant? Where does it need to actually fit, and what sort of process should it go through? These are all things that need to be carefully considered. One thing we built documentation for Compound is after the double entry point issue with TrueUSD, we documented much more heavily what are the security risks of tokens that you're listing. Look for things like infinite mint, look for issues around someone maybe having the ability to upgrade without time locks, things that you just want to be aware of when you're listing a token, not just the financial risks, but also the technical risks. Even if it's been audited, has it been audited to work with your protocol specifically? And then monitoring is a big thing that we've been focusing on, monitoring for things like governance attacks. With Compound, we monitor for, has anyone borrowed enough Compound tokens to either influence a proposal or even pass quorum on their own? That's important to know about. But also just as simple as like what proposals are coming up, when are they going to be time locked, that sort of thing. And then there's actually going to be a workshop later today about what the tool we're using, Forta, and how that could potentially be used in other ways. And then finally, one thing that is near and dear to my heart, which is the idea of actually defining off-chain rules outside of your code. So despite the fact that we all like on-chain code to enforce things, there are some things that you simply cannot enforce. Like upgradability is a blank check in some cases. Outside of for the actual contracts that are upgradable, you can't protect against that in the code without compromising on your ability to upgrade, but you can write off-chain rules that are incredibly explicit, such as the ENS Constitution that says we will never, specifically signed by 40,000 accounts, ever take away someone's ENS domain for so-and-so reason. Yes, there is technically no way for the DAO to be stopped from doing that, but the mass amount of the community can still be very aware that that is a no-no, and that if anyone is proposing that, then they should be laughed out of the room and not taken seriously. And if they're really attempting it, then we need to think about that as almost an attack. So at least there's a community consensus. And then so overall, the concept of DevSecOps, of having your security built heavily into the DevOps process for how you are deploying proposals in any code, is really where we need to pair that with also the governance processes of how these decisions are made for DAOs. And I think there's actually a lot of opportunity to do some really interesting novel ideas of let's just say code governance that I don't think has really been possible in any other industry. But it's also going to be very, very challenging, and we'll just have to continue to work on it carefully. And then finally, delegation of operational decisions. Simply put, like, not everything has to go up for a vote. You can delegate some of these decisions. MakerDAO is very famous for the core unit model and basically creating operational units that are given a budget and focus on a specific domain, such as development, finance, treasury, et cetera. And then you also have things such as, oh, hey, we see an attack happening in the middle of the night. We're not going to be able to get all the token holders to show up to a vote, even if we didn't have like a 7-day governance process we have to go through anyway. So we need to have backups. We need to have the ability for an emergency multi-sig, such as the Compound Pause Guardian, but possibly other mechanisms to quickly respond. And it should probably be, as other talks have mentioned, something that is not overly powerful. It shouldn't have the ability to do like powerful upgrades, or that could be a problem on its own, but maybe just pause or do limited things that can at least, protect the protocol in the short term, while in the long term, there is a governance decision made on how to address that particular attack. And then finally, there are interesting ideas around optimistic governance, the ability for anyone to maybe make a decision unilaterally, but you build in a challenge window for people to be able to say, hey, I disagree with this, and maybe we should actually put it to a vote, depending on what it is. And there's a lot of work being done by Optimism, specifically using Zodiac and Genosis Safe to try to figure that out. And then finally, again, this was already said by Nico, but having the ability to permission things is very useful. But all of this also comes with a greater amount of complexity and bureaucracy that you really have to balance and consider ahead of time. So, yeah, you've built all this kind of bureaucracy and structure that should scale better, but do people actually understand what's going on enough to still make decisions on the DAO level? So these are all things you just have to very carefully think about. And there's not one solution, but just an awareness of the problem is a good starting point. So to take everything I've thrown at you into a nice diagram, because I've mostly been putting text on the screen, this is how I think about on-chain governance scaling. I think about it as we are building on this implicit L1 protocol, specifically Ethereum in a lot of these cases. And then we can also build immutable smart contracts that are not upgradable, that are either mature enough or clear enough that we have no need to change them now or in the future, or maybe contracts that were at one point upgradable, but we've decided to burn the upgrade roll and effectively keep it as is going forward. And then there are other things that we will have to govern through a DAO or some other structure. So if you're using a governor smart contract, then maybe that's how you govern your markets and other things. And then finally, you can create multi-sigs for doing more rapid discussions, or maybe more expert decisions, or whatever you feel is appropriate. And then eventually you get to the operational layer of, we're just going to delegate specific responsibilities to a specific org or a specific person, and they are going to be allowed to make unilateral decisions, but the authority is filtered down. So at any point, a multi-sig could revoke permission for an operational unit that is behaving badly, or reverse one of their decisions if needed. And then the DAO can decide to reverse or revoke permissions for a multi-sig. And then an immutable smart contract and L1 protocol governance gives you a baseline to build this on that you don't have to worry about changing. So an example of this could be used with Compound, which is kind of how I conceptually think about it, is we're built on Ethereum. There is an immutable comp token, which is used for governance. So having that be immutable is good, because you don't have to worry about the share of governance power changing. But then we still have Compound Governor, and then we also have Compound V2 and V3 that is governed by that governor. And then we have multi-sig councils. The Pause Guardian responds to alerts. There's also a grant committee that has existed in the past and is now being discussed as being resurrected. And then finally, we have some entities. Compound Labs still does protocol development. Gauntlet does financial risk management. And OpenZeppelin offers security services. So going forward, DAOs are still going to require a lot of iteration. So when you're building a DAO, don't just think of it as, oh, everything will be hunky-dory once we give the community the ability to govern this because surely they know what they're doing. You actually have to think of it more adversarially because it's permissionless. Anyone can come in, which means anyone can attack it. So you have to think of that as a permissionless system that needs to be built with an adversarial mindset, and then you need to actively monitor it and ensure that it isn't being attacked, and you have a community that is able to respond, or if not a community, then specific actors that have been delegated that responsibility. And overall, I see this all tying into how we scale Ethereum, not just in terms of comparing it to the scalability trilemma, but looking directly at rollups as the obvious solution everyone talks about, even after the merge. That's where all the fun scaling activity is going to happen. And look at their upgradability. And look at that. Basically, the vast majority of TVL on Ethereum is upgradable today. So governance is still a massive potential pain point. And the reason they're upgradable is for a good reason. This is all both optimistic and ZK rollups are very new technology. There could be a bug. There could be an issue. Do we really want to risk $1 billion of TVL on not having the ability to address a bug? Sure, but it also means that we have to be very careful about that power. We have to be aware that it exists, and we also need to have plans to eventually scale. As it scales and matures, we have that power to decentralize and reduce over time. You can even see ZK Sync does have like a time lock ability on their upgrades, although they do have a no delay function if they have a large number of multi-sig that signs for an emergency. So you can, in lockstep, eventually get to a point where maybe either upgradability is greatly decentralized or even potentially removed entirely. But for now, we're going to have to live with it. And many of the L2s that we're going to build on for our clients are going to be building on it anyway, so we might as well figure out how to deal with it. So in terms of anyone who's building with governance today and wants to eventually move in that direction, I would say start small. Carefully consider how you're going to distribute governance power because it's really hard to go back and make decisions about how it's like, write the Constitution and then try to pass a constitutional amendment. It's kind of tough. So definitely when you start out, try to do it, do as much as you can to protect the protocol then, and then allow it to scale out over time. And slowly delegate out the governance power, scale decision-making, but ensure that even as you delegate, that there's still some accountability to the DAO as a whole, and you can revoke it, or otherwise ensure that you're not going to be put at the mercy of a small clique or any of the other groups that people think run Ethereum behind the scenes. In reality, we know that that's very much more complicated than that, but we can prove it by having very clear, transparent governance processes that show how decisions are made and ensure that attackers are not going to be able to get away with any potential malfeasance. So that is pretty much it. If you were curious about the compound stuff specifically, there's a bunch of posts that I made on the forum, and then also security monitoring with Borda. And yeah, I guess I should say we're hiring at OpenZeppelin because everyone else is saying that. So that's on the website as well. I think we're good. Thank you.